Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. Usually on this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. However, this week we are bringing you a bonus episode. It's the second part in a trilogy of crossover podcasts with Don't Point That Horror at Me, in which we are covering all of the Fear Street movies one by one across 3 consecutive weeks. Last week we brought you the first part in this trilogy, in which we discussed Fear Street Part 1, 1994, the spoiler-free half of the chat here on EOH, and the spoilerific conclusion of the conversation happened on Don't Point That Horror at Me podcast. This week we're doing the exact same thing with Part 2 of Fear Street, that's 1978, which dropped on Netflix this weekend. So, what you're about to hear is the first half of our discussion, in which we review the movie spoiler-free, just discuss our thoughts very briefly. Then, don't forget to head on over to Don't Point That Horror at Me podcast to hear the second half of our discussion, where we discuss 1978 in nitty-gritty detail. So, please enjoy my conversation with the brilliant Jill Nolan and Becky Dark as we talk all things Fear Street 1978. Becky and Jill, hello again.
Hello, mate.
Hi again, mate.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, fine.
Well,
all good, thanks. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm excited. Are you ready to get into some 1970s nostalgia this week?
Very much so.
I remember it well.
Oh, those were the days, weren't they? So, before we get into this, obviously this is another film that is like very much harking back on nostalgia, particularly of horror movies of this era, right? Jill, I remember you said, I know you said you were a fan of some of the 90s horrors. You're not like the biggest horror fan. I just wondered, how familiar were you with like some of these sort of 70s and 80s slasher movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween? Like, have you kind of seen, or sort of, do you know much about all of those ones?
Not really, no. I've seen sort of like bits here and there, or like, you know, it's so ingrained in pop culture, those Halloween films, and then working in the costume shop as well, like they are like classic characters. I'm not, you know, I can't point out specific references, but the whole vibe of it and like the summer camp thing comes up in Point Horror a lot as well. I recognised it, but you guys will probably be able to say this is a reference to this and blah blah blah, and I'll just sit here and learn.
Becky, I'm sure as anyone who's listened to us, particularly on my Patreon, knows, but you're a pretty big sort of early 80s slasher fan, right?
I'm a huge fan, although it has been a relatively recent kind of learning and sort of adoption of these films, like in terms of my horror appreciation, because I mean I was very much that person who, when Scream first came out and I was watching Scream, I had no fucking idea what they were talking about. Like, obviously being alive during the big slasher boom and the kind of holy trinity of Freddy and Jason and Michael, like I got it, but I didn't watch any of those films at the time, and so I've come to them relatively late, but huge fan. Like Friday this is very kind of camp, like summer camp counselors based, this Fear Street film, and I think like it's so difficult and it does tend to kind of fluctuate, but out of Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Friday the 13th, I think Friday the 13th is my favorite. So like I very much love this kind of this like body count, you know, one kind of like just crazed sort of very like focused killer who just like chops in half everybody he encounters. But what I liked with this one was then you do get that kind of continuation from the first film, but also then like that sort of underlying lore, I guess, about like Sarah Fear and like all of the witchy stuff as well. So yeah.
Would you say there's a big difference in like the style and the tropes between like the old 80s slashers like Friday the 13th and then the 90s ones, like the ones we discussed on last week's episode?
I think there are differences, but I do think that the 90s, especially with Scream kicking off the 90s slasher cycle, really, I mean, you know, there's arguments that could be made, but really, and it being so referential of the 80s slashers, I think there is stuff that kind of continues through, but then, you know, as Scream kind of then kicked off that whole new rash of films, then it kind of generated its own tropes kind of from there on.
Yeah.
So I do think there are differences, but then there are also similarities.
Yeah.
But what this film I thought like did really well was that kind of that very like late 70s, early 80s slasher thing of like, you know, sex and drugs and like sexy, drugsy teens, and then them just like meeting bloody ends.
Absolutely. It's a little bit more kind of, in terms of the plot of the 80s and 70s ones, they're a bit more basic, aren't they, really? It's like teens misbehave and then they die, really. That's kind of usually the gist, especially of the Friday the 13th movies. Yeah. And in pretty brutal ways, often more brutal and more gory than the 90s horrors as well, on the whole, probably.
Yeah, well, that's probably one of the biggest criticisms, I think, that's leveled against the 90s slasher cycle, isn't it? About it being a bit sanitized, a bit glossy, a bit too focused on like the celebrities and, you know, all of that kind of thing. I personally don't level that at it as a criticism. I fucking love it. But I know that, you know, the sort of slightly more wizened horror crowd that aren't particularly keen on the 90s slashers, like that would definitely be something that they would say, you know, that they don't like so much about it, is this idea of it just not being grimy and gory enough.
Yeah, the old ones have that sort of like video nasty VHS kind of grain to them, which the 90s ones don't have. The 90s ones are sort of super glossy, aren't they, I suppose? But yeah. So anyway, with all that being said, let's get into it. Let's begin our spoiler-free review of Fear Street 1978.
A witch. The town curse. I thought there was a way to end it. But now I know there is no end. This is July 12th, summer of 1978, the first day of camp. And a week later, my sister was dead.
Fear Street Part 2, 1978. The legend of the Camp Nightwing massacre is famous throughout rival towns Shadyside and Sunnyvale. Camp counselor Tommy Slater went crazy and embarked on a brutal murder spree. But did Tommy just snap, or was he another victim of Sarah Fear's witch curse? The truth could be what Dina and Josh need to save their friend Sam from a fate worse than death. Lovely.
Dun, dun, dun.
Lovely. Another beautifully written R.L. Stein-esque blurb there for Becky. Congratulations,
well
Becky.
Thanks, guys.
So as your synopsis so perfectly puts there, it kind of is, it sort of continues last week's story, right? Where we've got Dina and Josh, they need to help save their friend Sam, who's been possessed. They come to this woman, this like slightly older woman, who phones them and says, I know how you can stop this because it happened to me when I was young. And then we basically spend the rest of the film, don't we, in 1978 in this summer camp with all of these new characters and everything. Jill, what did you think of part 2 and how did it compare to part 1 for you?
I did enjoy it, but I think just naturally the 90s story was more to my taste. But I did enjoy it. Again, I enjoyed the music. There were some great music choices. And like the summer camp setting is very point horror-esque. And the continuation of like learning a bit more about the witchcraft and Sarah Fear, The Legend of, and meeting.
It's even witchier, this one, isn't it, than the first one? It's getting gradually more witchy as we go, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Becky, what about you? What did you think of 1978?
I liked it. Yeah, I did like it. I didn't like it as much as the first one. I think it had elements, or it had sections where I was getting a little bit distracted, a little bit bored.
Yeah, agreed.
Maybe picking up my phone to just have a little checky, see what was going on. I found with the first one that I didn't really have that, and I hadn't really noticed that I was super kind of like engaged maybe until I was watching this one, and I realized that I was kind of getting a bit distracted, and I was like, oh, I didn't really get this in the first one. So a little bit slower in places, but on the whole I enjoyed it, and I thought that it did capture that like 70s kind of camp. Not that I was there, like what the fuck do I know? But from what I've seen in the movies, it captured that vibe. And again, I mean, like going back to what Jill said, like the who was the fucking music supervisor on these films? Because
and how much budget went
wall bangers.
How much budget went on the music rights for some of these songs as well?
Honestly,
like, some impressive needle drops in this one as well.
Like so good, yeah. So yeah, I loved it. I did. Like, yeah, I enjoyed it, but not as much.
Yeah, I'm the same as you guys. I did like it. Almost the opposite trajectory where, like, when I talked about 1994, how I started off a little bit like, I'm not sure if I'm going to like this, because of that kind of nostalgia vomit and that kind of Stranger Things-esque kind of vibe that I'm not that into. But then as it went on, I got really into the story. I was really into these characters, and I was quite invested by the final act when people were being put through bread slicers and things. And I was like really genuinely shocked and impressed by it. This one, I think I sort of went on the opposite trajectory. When it started, I was like, oh, I think I'm going to love this one even more, because I love the summer camp vibe. I love that sort of Friday the 13th feel. I really like the main character of Ziggy. I think I much prefer her to Dina, if we kind of say she's our main character in the first one. I found her really like compelling, and I really liked her. But it does feel like the last act or the last half drags a little bit for me, and we can talk about it in spoilers, but there's one plot strand when two characters are basically sort of stuck underground while all this other, and it feels like it just goes on and on and on for a very long time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like this one maybe could have done with a little snip here and there. It could have done with cutting down
actually,
slightly.
I wanted to mention this in our chat about the first one, but they are surprisingly long. Not long. Like long, you know, they're not like 2.5 hours, but I think the first one is like an hour 45 or an hour 50. This one is nearly 2 hours. And as I say, with the first one, I didn't notice it quite so much. Definitely with this one, like they could have cut like 15-20 minutes out of it, and I don't think you would have missed it.
Especially because this one is a lot more, like you said, it's that 80s or 70s horror vibe of like, it's really just a single guy going around murdering people, and that is a bit less, like, you don't need to spend that long on that in a way. And I think, they are all quite, I thought that, they're all quite long, even the first one. I think because I was looking when I watched the first one a second time that, you know, it's only about an hour and 20, an hour and 25 minutes in before the sort of end, quote unquote, and then you get to the epilogue, and it's like, I suppose all of these movies have got to do a bit of heavy lifting where they've got to, like, they give you the setup, and then this one goes back to the 70s, and then it has to give you the ending.
That is true, actually,
and it has to go back to the present day at the end, doesn't it, and everything. So it's got a lot of sort of plot mechanics to do in a way, but I still think this one could have been tighter, probably. But that's not to say, I mean, it is really fun. The music was great. Some of the characters are really fun. It had some good moments and some good gore again, didn't it, I think?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, like we talked about in the first one about them being like rated R. And, you know, Jill and I talk about the point horror books, which are like, we get excited if like two of the main characters like share a kiss. Yeah. It's like, yay, they've kissed.
Oh my God, saucy.
Like filmed in front of a studio audience. Like,
there's proper banging in there.
Like proper banging.
Proper banging, yeah. And I thought that was, again, really, like we talked about initially, like the difference between 70s slashers and 90s was also that
the 90s didn't have a lot of sex in it, and you know, even when you watch the Scream films, it's like there's the moment when Neve Campbell strips down to her bra, and that's it, basically, isn't it? Whereas Friday the 13th movies are renowned for that, for like people banging in bunk beds and hammocks, and
for people
in the
being killed like while they're having sex.
Yes, literally, human kebabs, like skewered while they're having sex, and that kind of thing. So I guess again, it's kind of doing clever things where it's upping the kind of the graphic content almost for this one, isn't it, compared to last week's?
Yeah, and I think that's knowing. I think they have done that specifically. Like, you know, the 1994 version was very much in the style of the 90s slashers, and you even get it when you cut. You know, we talked about the bit where they all take a nice pause amongst the killings to all like go to Pound Town, as I think Simon
that's right,
Simon graciously puts it. But they come out, like, you don't see anything. They come out of the toilets, and even Kate says about like her and Josh's little fumble in the toilet cubicle. She says, "Oh, we barely got past first base." And then with this, you're literally about 10 minutes into the film, and you have got like full fucking yeah, you know. So I think that is all done very, you know, knowingly, which I like.
And there's also that feeling that, like, in 80s movies especially, and 70s, kids were meaner back then. Like, don't you think, Jill, like, as soon as we meet these characters, like, this isn't really a spoiler because it happens right at the beginning, these bullies are gonna like burn this girl and stuff, and suddenly it's like, it feels a bit more Stephen King, where you've got these like real horrible villains in this one, I think, compared to the 90s one.
I think the sort of gang we get to know in the 90s are a lot nicer than the sort of the characters in the 78. Yeah, definitely.
That bit where they are like, they've basically got her strung up to a tree and they're like burning her with a Zippo. It was a bit like,
all right,
guys, this is like,
here we go.
Yeah, I know. These were some evil and they remind me of, like, you know, the bullies in something like It or something, you know, those, or even Stand By Me, like those, the bullies that are proper sociopaths, you know.
Where you're watching it as a kid. Like, I mean, I know the later It films are more recent, but like definitely when I used to watch Stand By Me, and, you know, you'd get Kiefer Sutherland's character, and I'm watching it as a kid, just like, this is like my worst nightmare.
Yeah.
Like, imagine fucking getting confronted by this psychopath.
No, you used to be like, is this what sort of high school is going to be like? Oh my God. Like, everyone's got flick knives. It's terrifying. But yeah, so they're all in some ways a bit less likable, I think, some of these characters. Even the two that we see going to Pound Town right at the beginning are like, and then initially you're like, oh God, these people are all awful. But again, it kind of takes you on a journey with some of them, doesn't it, I think, which we can talk about later. But yeah, so overall, I mean, I don't know if there's much more to say in a kind of spoiler-free way. Anything else you guys want to mention before we get into specifics?
I also, like, timing-wise, again, I thought there were moments of like pop culture references, which I thought it did really well. So there's one bit where it references Stephen King, which again, I always think's really funny, because Jill and I, there's been a couple of books that we've covered on Don't Point That Horror at Me, where one of the kids will be like reading a Stephen King book. And I think it might have actually been...
I think it is R.L. Stein. I think it's in the
isn't it?
Babysitter, I think, where there's a bit of shade thrown old Kingy's way.
Yeah, exactly. And I quite liked that he kind of came up in this, and they don't throw shade actually, but they kind of refer to having read a book rather than seen a film and stuff, which I thought was nice. So I do think like they have obviously put quite a lot of thought and kind of, I don't know, like effort, I guess, into writing this in a clever way and not just shoehorning the nostalgia into it for the sake of nostalgia's sake. Like, they seem to actually like give a shit, which I like. Like, they, you know, they care about being accurate and stuff. I mean, I don't know. We'll come to Jill and the music. the music is a separate thing, but you know, with like the way that the kind of characters interact with each other and stuff, I liked. And I guess, the only other point that I sort of wanted to make was about the kind of relationships within it, like with between the sisters and stuff. Like, again, going back to, you know, the 70s horror tropes and things, you know, with the slashers, you tend to get this kind of final girl sort of character who will come out at the end. And what I really liked about this one was you didn't really get one final girl. It was like, I liked the way that you know, you were saying, Mike, that you really liked the kind of central figure of Ziggy, who's played by again, going back to the Stranger Things like Netflix thing. She's from the second series onwards, I think. I've seen them all, but I can't remember any of their names. But I liked that interplay between the sisters. And even though there was less to like about the characters in this film, I feel like that was on purpose, because, again, going back to the kind of body count slasher movies, it was all about like setting up these slightly obnoxious kids to just see them bumped off.
Yeah.
Where you're sort of...
I liked the sort of sisters thing, because me and my sister are like the older, snitchier one, and she's like the young, sort of, you know, free-spirited, sort of cool, slightly cooler.
Yes.
Not so much now, because I'm real cool, but yeah, when we were little, I was definitely a bit of a snitch.
I love it. And how good a job do you think it did at like tying in with the first one as well? Like, obviously, and we won't spoil too much, but Jill, like, obviously there are some characters. It does that Back to the Future thing, doesn't it? Where it's like, oh, here are younger versions maybe of some of the characters we met in the first one and that kind of thing. Did you kind of enjoy that part?
I did actually really enjoy that, because, again, it's that sort of thing of like spotting it. So when we were introduced to sort of all the kids at the camp, and then you're like, oh, that's the policeman from before, like the first one, and like, just joining up the dots and seeing where that's going to go. Was quite enjoyable, definitely.
Yeah, you said, Becky, didn't you, when you read a bit about the R.L. Stine series, that there are certain families that come into a lot of the stories, and you mentioned the good family, right? And I guess they're doing something similar here, where we're meeting members of certain families at different points across time.
Exactly, yeah. So the like Sheriff Good in the first one, here you see him as like a kid. And it's really interesting, actually, the way they kind of set him up as like his dad was a policeman, and so there's a lot of expectation around him, and that kind of I guess influences some of like the decisions that he makes and stuff. So that was really interesting. And then there's at least one other character that we've seen in the first film that kind of we see here, and then you can kind of like make that link back. And exactly like Jill says, like, it's cool to kind of go like, oh, okay, yeah, like, and some of the actions that are taken by the sheriff in the first one, you sort of understand a little bit more in this one when you get to learn a bit more about like the relationships and stuff. So yeah, I thought that worked really well.
Yeah, that's pretty good, isn't it? Finally then, I want to ask you, would you guys recommend this? But also, two parts to this question. Would you recommend this to people that haven't seen the first one? Could you just enjoy this as like a standalone slasher film, like you could with a lot of slasher sequels, for example? Jill, what do you reckon?
I think it is obviously better if you've seen the first one, because it is so interlinked, and like the beginning of this one follows on from...
Would make no sense.
Yeah, but I mean, if you were just looking for something that was, you know, sort of a feel of those slashers, but new and made today, and you just want to see people getting chopped the fuck up, then go for it.
Yeah, Becky, what do you reckon?
I think Jill makes a really good point, actually. Like, enough of the film, because it is bookended by the first film and characters there, but the vast majority of it is in that like 70s set camp. And I think if you maybe aren't such a fan of 90s slashers, but you are more of a fan of 70s slashers and just want to see more of that, give it a bash. Like, you can even fast forward through, you know, the kind of prologue and skip the epilogue and just watch a bunch of, you know, camp counselors, and because like that's the other thing about it. Like, again, it doesn't pull any punches, this film. You know, sometimes if people are talking about like Friday the 13th, you have to get into the later installments until there are even any children like at the camp, because they're all kind of set in
Before,
like setup.
Yes.
So it is all those like late 20s looking teens that are actually getting like brutally bumped off anyway. Whereas in this, like, it is not here. It is a fully functioning camp and there are kids. So that, like, for me really kind of upped the peril and some of the like, you know, fuck it out moments. So yeah, I think Jill makes a really, really good point that maybe if the 70s stuff is slightly more your thing than the 90s stuff, then give it a bash and you can just ignore the stuff that is like,
it's so true,
you know, harping back to the first film.
And Becky, we've talked about before, but like there's the famous sort of slasher trope, I suppose, that the sequel is bloodier, it's gorier, and it's like a bigger body count and it's more carnage than the first one, basically. Do you think that this movie sort of lives up to that trope?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. I think it, I mean, like, the body count's definitely
100%, because there's only 2 or 3 sort of key deaths in the first one. As shocking as they are, there are less of them, aren't there? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so cool, actually. I hadn't thought of that at all until you've just asked me that. But yeah, it definitely does. And in fact, like, I won't spoil it, but there's one shot that really kind of brings that home. And yeah, so I think it definitely does kind of step it up. It's an unusual sequel in some ways because, you know, if you think about just any like classic kind of follow up to a first installment, it hasn't necessarily been planned the way these have. You know, these have very much been planned as a 3, as a trilogy that are being released as an event on Netflix over 3 weeks. And obviously with, you know, traditional sequels, those conversations might be going on when, you know, an initial film is in cinemas or whatever, but it all very much depends on the money that they make back and the success and all of that kind of thing. It's less common that a franchise or a trilogy or something is planned that way before the first one is made. So I think that kind of influences, I guess, like the tone of this second one. But, you know, you do make a really good point that it does step it up. And again, that's got to be like a conscious decision. So yeah, I love it.
And I think you're totally right. Like, I think in some ways it has a lot in common with not so much horror sequels, but some of those like Back to the Future 2 and so many things after it, like The Matrix or whatever, where they made 2 and 3 together. And part 2 feels a bit like a middle chapter where it's got to do quite a lot of heavy lifting, maybe, where it's sort of continuing the first one, but it's also maybe setting stuff up for the next one, as well as sort of doing its own thing and having more action and more carnage. And I guess that's why this film is bigger and bulkier, maybe, and maybe a bit more sort of flabby.
Yeah.
Than the first one, you know?
A bit clunkier, trying to fit all of these elements in, you know, hitting the references and then, you know, tying it all together. But I think, you know, but they do manage it. It's not, you know, I'd watch it again.
Totally. And,
same.
And, you know, like, as with last week, it ended with me very excited for next week, right? To see the 1666 one. Like, it's done its job in that it's not like I've gone, I'm bored now, I'm going to drop out, you know, kind of thing.
100%. Yeah, you know, I think that could be a risk with for Netflix, with formatting something this way, where it's like you've got the big bang of the first one, and then, you know, we've talked about, you know, the kind of continuation was a decent enough cliffhanger that you are like, yes, I want to come back. If this second one hadn't succeeded, people might have stopped here. And, you know, the third one might massively drop off. But I think they did a good enough job at the end of this one where I'm like, yeah, I'll watch the next one, you know.
And let me just finish with that before we get into spoilers to end this little segment of the conversation. What are your thoughts and what are your anticipations for next week's? At this point we're recording it, we haven't seen it yet. 1666, and from what we know from maybe from clips and pictures, that it's going to be some sort of witchy, almost Salem witch trial-esque kind of story or something, right? Jill, are you into that? Are you looking forward to that one?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know how much I can say without spoilers, but yeah, at the end of this film, there's a little preview, very Back to the Future-esque. Especially because it's going back to olden times.
Yeah, so true.
Very Back to the Future 3. I'm really looking forward to it. It looks like we're going to see some familiar faces again. In a different context. So how that's going to work out? Are they going to defeat the witch? You know, I'm here for it. I'm ready to find out.
I know, that's also very Back to the Future, right? That it looks like, again, without spoiling, because this is just from previews, but it looks like they're casting some of the same actors to play maybe their ancestors or something in the 1666 one. How are you feeling about the anticipation for next week's one, Becky?
Oh yeah, I'm up for it. Very much so. Everything that you guys have just said basically sums up my feelings about it. I am excited to kind of take that step back in time as well. And again, you know, they've played it cleverly because we've got the 90s, we've got the 70s, which are obviously such clearly like delineated moments in like horror, I guess. And then there's this whole other, I suppose, like slightly more recent focus on that more kind of like, I want it to be a bit like folk horror, you know, like I want it to kind of to go a bit like, you know, Robert Eggers' The Witch, like that kind of, but for it to also hopefully be a bit fun and having that, like you say, about having like familiar faces playing their ancestors and that like wrap around of the first two films. So yeah, it's up my street.
It's bold, isn't it, as well? Because I'm assuming it's going to be a completely different sort of genre to the first two, really. It's not going to feel like a kind of cool music, sort of slasher filled with pop music and stuff. I'm assuming, although who knows? Who knows? We'll wait and see. So there you go. Well, guys, we'll move over then to your podcast, to Don't Point That Horror at Me, to have a spoilerific discussion of this movie. So just wrapping up here, tell us, Becky, where can people find you and your podcast if they want to continue this discussion?
Yeah, so we are Don't Point That Horror at Me, and on all the socials we are at Point Horror Pod. But our spoilerific discussion will be going out the same day as this one. So yeah, come and find us to get the chat.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for our spoiler-free discussion of Fear Street 1978. As we mentioned there, you can continue listening to our discussion in spoilerific detail over on Don't Point That Horror at Me. In the meantime, stay tuned for our next pairing of episodes as we conclude the Fear Street trilogy next week with our discussion of Fear Street 1666. Cannot wait. Join us again soon for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.